He promised peace, clarity, a quieter mind in a loud world. What he really built was a silence so deep that people vanished inside it. The man at the center of it all was named Eli Rowe, and he looked like nothing to fear. Mid-40s, calm eyes, soft movements, the kind of face that felt familiar even if you had never seen it before. He dressed simple, spoke slow, breathed like every second mattered. In a city addicted to chaos, Eli sold stillness. His meditation studio sat on the edge of downtown, tucked between a closed yoga shop and a tattoo parlor that never opened before noon. Inside, the lights were warm and low. The air smelled like sandalwood and something earthy, something grounding. Phones were turned off at the door. Shoes lined the wall like offerings. People came in broken, burned-out tech workers, college students drowning in anxiety, single parents barely holding it together. Veterans who could not sleep, Eli welcomed all of them the same way, with a nod and a smile that made it feel safe to finally exhale. He called the place the center, not a business, not a religion, just a space to return to yourself. At least that is how it started. The classes were simple at first. Breathing exercises, long silences, visualization techniques that felt intense but harmless. Eli spoke in a low, steady rhythm, guiding people inward. He talked about letting go of ego, of cutting through noise, of finding truth beneath fear. Students left feeling lighter, clearer, addicted to the calm. They came back, again and again. Soon the classes filled up. Waiting lists formed. Word spread fast online, especially after a few viral posts about people having emotional breakthroughs on the mat. Grown adults crying in silence. Panic attacks melting away. Years of stress gone in an hour. Eli never advertised. He said the right people always find their way. That line alone hooked them. Then came the small changes. The center started offering advanced sessions, longer, deeper, more intense. These were invite only. Eli said not everyone was ready to go that far. He framed it as protection, like he was keeping people safe from something they were not prepared to face. Those chosen felt special. Advanced sessions meant stricter rules: no caffeine, no alcohol, no social media, no negative influences. That last one was vague on purpose. Students were encouraged to audit their lives and remove anything that disrupted their peace. Slowly, quietly, people began pulling away from friends, from family. Parents complained that their kids stopped calling. Partners said their significant others felt distant, hollow, like they were physically present but mentally gone. Some students quit their jobs, claiming work was an illusion that fed anxiety. Eli called it shedding. He talked about how growth always looks like loss to people who are afraid of change. Nobody argued with results. Students looked calmer, smiled more, moved like they were floating just above the ground, but there were cracks. One woman mentioned during a session that she felt dizzy after meditating for hours without food. Eli reframed it as weakness leaving the body. A man had a panic episode and was told to breathe through it, to sit in it, to accept it as proof the process was working. Discomfort meant progress. Pain meant truth. And truth, Eli said, was never comfortable. The center introduced retreats, weekend-long at first, then full weeks, remote locations, cabins deep in the woods, no phones, no contact with the outside world. Total immersion. Families hated it. Some tried to intervene. They showed up at the studio demanding answers. Eli never raised his voice. He spoke slowly, respectfully. He framed concerned relatives as people who did not understand the journey, people projecting fear onto growth. Students watched him handle conflict with grace. It made them trust him more. By the time the first person disappeared, nobody called it that. They said she went off-grid. Her name was Marissa Cole, 26. Graphic designer, joined the center after a bad breakup. She attended every class, posted about how meditation saved her life. Then one day her Instagram went quiet. Her parents said she left a note saying she needed space. Her roommate said Marissa moved out overnight and left most of her stuff behind. Illy told people she had reached a level of clarity that required solitude. Weeks passed. Then another student stopped showing up. Then another. Different backgrounds, different ages, same pattern, deep involvement, sudden absence, no contact. Illy said disappearance was just another word people used when they did not respect boundaries. The city moved on, people always do, until a local journalist noticed something strange, a pattern. All the missing students had one thing in common beyond the center. They had attended a private retreat at a property Illy owned under a shell company, a piece of land that did not show up on the studio website. No photos, no address shared publicly. The journalist filed a request for missing persons data. 3 names became 5, 5 became 9, 9 became too many to ignore. Police finally stepped in, but quietly. No press, no sirens. They started by interviewing families. Then former students who had left the center feeling uneasy but unable to explain why. Each interview sounded different, but the feeling was the same. They all described Illy as calm, supportive, nonviolent, and somehow terrifying, not because he yelled or threatened, but because he made people doubt themselves. Investigators visited the center posing as interested clients. They sat in sessions, watched how Illy controlled the room without touching anyone, how his silence commanded more obedience than shouting ever could. They noticed how students looked at him, like he was the only solid thing in their world. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This was not meditation anymore. It was conditioning, a system designed to strip identity, isolate individuals, and replace their sense of self with obedience disguised as enlightenment. And somewhere beyond the calm music and closed eyes, people were disappearing, not by force, but by belief. By the time police realized what they were dealing with, Eli Rowe had already moved the most devoted followers off the grid, and the real nightmare was just beginning. By the time law enforcement admitted there was a problem, Eli Rowe was already 3 steps ahead. The first official report labeled the situation as voluntary disappearances, adults choosing to disconnect. No signs of struggle, no financial crimes, no forced confinement, just people who decided to vanish in a world that made it easier than ever to do so. But something about the timing felt wrong. Detective Aaron Whitman felt it the moment he laid the photos across his desk. 9 faces, calm smiles, peaceful eyes, all taken within weeks of their final retreat, all looking lighter than before, like gravity had loosened its grip on them. People did not look like that right before cutting off everyone they loved. Whitman had seen cult cases before. They always started the same way: charisma, isolation, spiritual language twisted into authority. What made this different was the absence of fear. No threats, no weapons. No visible force, just belief. The property tied to Illy's shell company sat deep in the northern woods, officially listed as a wellness retreat center, legally compliant, inspections clean. When police first visited, they found nothing alarming. Cabins were orderly, food supplies stocked, meditation rooms spotless, too spotless. No personal items, no photos, no journals. No trace that people had actually lived there for weeks at a time. Illy explained it calmly. Possessions create attachment. Attachment creates suffering. Whitman watched him closely. Illy never blinked when answering questions, never hesitated, never showed irritation. He spoke like a man who had rehearsed the truth so many times it no longer felt like an act. When asked about the missing students, Illy said something that stuck. Sometimes people are ready to leave the story they were born into. It was not an admission, but it felt like one. Investigators began tracking financial records. Bank accounts belonging to several missing students had been drained shortly before their disappearance. Not stolen, transferred willingly, donations, gifts, contributions to the center, legal on paper. Then came the emails, deleted from inboxes but recoverable from servers, messages sent to family members that did not sound like the people who wrote them, flat, detached, repetitive phrases about freedom and clarity and release. One mother broke down when detectives read them aloud. "That is not my daughter. She never talked like that." The deeper they looked, the darker the structure became. Former students described advanced rituals held late at night. Extended fasting, sleep deprivation disguised as enlightenment, hours-long meditation sessions where Eli's voice looped the same phrases again and again, slowly stripping resistance. "You are safe here." The outside world wants to pull you back into pain. Your fear is proof you are close to truth. Trust me, he never demanded obedience outright. He framed it as choice, as growth, as courage, and when someone hesitated, the group handled it. Students were encouraged to gently confront doubt in others, to remind them of their purpose, to isolate anyone who questioned Eli's guidance, control without chains. One former follower, a man named Lucas, finally cracked during an interview. He had left the retreat early after experiencing what he called a psychological collapse. He said Eli introduced something called the final quiet. It was not advertised, not explained in advance. Those chosen were told they were ready to let go of self entirely, to become vessels of pure awareness, to step beyond fear. The final quiet involved complete sensory deprivation. Dark rooms, earplugs, blindfolds, days of silence, minimal food, no clocks. Lucas said time stopped making sense. Thoughts blurred, reality softened. He remembered Eli telling them that death itself was just another noise the mind makes. That was when Lucas panicked. He escaped the retreat in the middle of the night, barefoot, running through the trees until he found a road. He never looked back. Others did not run. Police began to suspect that the disappearances were not accidental, not voluntary in the way the law defined it. Something irreversible was happening during those final rituals. But suspicion was not proof. Everything changed when a hiker found a body. It was buried shallow, wrapped carefully in linen, hands folded across the chest, no signs of violence, no blunt force trauma. No restraints. The autopsy showed extreme dehydration and organ failure. Cause of death listed as complications from prolonged fasting and exposure. The victim was one of Eli's students. The story broke overnight. Headlines exploded. News vans flooded the center. Eli vanished before police could arrest him. The retreat property was abandoned. Cabins empty. Fires cold. The silence was overwhelming. Search teams combed the woods for days. They found more graves. All the bodies were treated with the same unsettling reverence, clean, calm, almost ceremonial, as if death itself had been framed as a peaceful transition. Whitman stood over one grave and felt something twist in his chest. These people were not murdered in the traditional sense. They were convinced to let themselves fade away. That realization hit harder than any violent crime scene he had ever worked. The twist came from an unexpected place. Eli Rowe was not his real name. Fingerprints pulled from archived wellness certification records matched a man declared dead 15 years earlier. A former therapist whose license had been revoked after a patient died during an experimental mindfulness program. He had vanished after the investigation, changed his name, refined his methods, and started again. The case shifted from missing persons to mass psychological homicide. A manhunt began, but Eli had one final move planned. And somewhere out there, a handful of his most devoted followers were still with him, ready for the final quiet. The crime was no longer about what had already happened. It was about how many more would disappear before the silence finally broke. The city was tense. Headlines screamed Eli Rowe, the meditation guru turned nightmare, but the man himself was gone, slipping through the cracks of the law like smoke. Whitman knew he was chasing a ghost, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing while convincing others to vanish with him. The investigation pivoted. Police dug into every retreat property, every shell company, every online post Eli had made. They interviewed families, former students, anyone who had crossed his path. Slowly, a map formed, a trail of vanished lives and carefully hidden retreats scattered across the state. Each site told the same story: clean cabins, empty rooms, rituals documented in journals and hidden videos, meticulously cataloged by Eli himself. But then a breakthrough came from the least expected source. A young woman named Naomi, who had joined the center only months before Marissa disappeared, contacted Whitman anonymously. She had left early, disgusted by what she called the obedience games. She carried evidence: audio recordings, journals, and photographs. Whitman listened in disbelief as Naomi described the final quiet, the days of sensory deprivation, the whispered mantras that hypnotized the mind, the careful manipulation that made students willingly drain their own accounts, abandon families, and walk into the woods convinced they were ascending to something higher. She had survived because she questioned Eli too soon. Fear, she said, saved her life. Armed with her evidence, investigators coordinated a sting. They tracked the locations Eli had hinted at in his private logs, predicting where he would lead his next group of advanced seekers. It was a remote retreat, hidden behind miles of dense forest. Police arrived before anyone else, securing the perimeter and setting up surveillance. What they found inside was chilling. The room where the final quiet was supposed to happen had been prepared meticulously. Pillows arranged in perfect circles, bowls of water placed just so, blindfolds stacked neatly. A soft hum of recorded meditation music played on a loop, and at the center a single chair, but it was empty. Eli was nowhere to be found. Whitman's gut told him he was close. That sense intensified when they discovered a hidden trapdoor beneath the floorboards. A narrow tunnel led into the woods, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. It was as if Eli had built the entire retreat to guide his followers to him, to the next step of his plan. Days turned into weeks as search teams combed the surrounding forest. They found remnants of previous retreats, campfires, makeshift tents, and buried caches of journals and personal items. Some of the journals contained confessions from students, poetic passages describing transcendence, bliss, and eventually fear. And then came the final twist. Naomi, helping investigators piece together Eli's network, realized something no one had noticed. Every retreat had been connected, not just physically, but financially. Each missing student had contributed to a fund that Eli controlled, a fund that grew exponentially as people disappeared. It wasn't just about psychological control. It was wealth, influence, power, meticulously disguised as enlightenment. Whitman pieced it together. This was no lone madman. This was a system, a long game. Eli had perfected the art of making people vanish willingly, then profited from their absence while maintaining the illusion of peace. The media called it a cult. The psychologists called it mind control. The families called it hell. Whitman never saw Eli caught. But months later, a tip came in from a border town. A man fitting Eli's description had been seen in a quiet town near the mountains. Police moved in, but he had vanished again, leaving only traces of his past behind. The students who survived carried scars that could never fully heal. Trust broken, families estranged, lives redirected by a man who promised calm but delivered terror. The darkest part, Whitman realized, was that Eli's methods were replicable. Anywhere there was desire for inner peace, someone like him could rise again. The line between spiritual guidance and psychological terror was thinner than anyone imagined. In the end, the center was shut down, retreats abandoned, students returned to their families where possible, graves filled, bodies mourned, and cities tried to move on, but the silence Eli left behind lingered. A silence that whispered in the minds of those who had followed him too far. A silence that reminded everyone that not all teachers are guides. Some are shadows, and some shadows never truly disappear.